So can I ask Ruth Goodwin, who's the CEO of the Better Than Cash Alliance, to ask the first question? Thank you. Do you need a microphone? Oh, there you go.
You. And I want to take up the point, one comment and one question, really briefly. My comment is on the arms race on digitization. It's always a very sexy term. And Professor Simon Johnson at MIT also used that term. And he was saying, if we don't recognize that is happening, we're not going to be one step behind Michael. We're going to be way behind because it's happening really quickly. We're not going to be 10 years behind, Professor Dunleavy. We're going to be 20 years behind if we don't take action. And so I would like to, on my comment, to say, we don't have an option to say, oh dear, we're behind, what are we going to do? Let's think about it. Our only option is to say, what is the action that we have to take as governments, the member states that IMF works with? What is the action we're going to take so that we don't get left behind, so that we don't get completely circumvented in the tax regime? So my question is, what is the call to action? What are we going to do? We can't just sit and say we're not going to do anything. We have to take action with our governments to be able to use the benefits of digitizing. India took action. They are saving $7 billion annually. They are using that to serve their citizens better. What is the action? Is it digital identification? Is it integrating PFM, as we have great budget people here, with the digitization? What is it better TA? What is the call to action? Thank you.
Question. Okay, so I'm going to take two more questions and then we're going to answer them all together. Or I could just take one and include a question from someone who is watching this remotely. Hello. Anyone? Okay. Oh, yep.
I would just like to ask about what were your views about digital connectivity amongst all of this? Because obviously this is great service from the government to increase digital inclusion from people. But what if people actually don't have digital access to fill in the tax reform or apply to a health service?
Wonderful. And then there's another, yep.
Hi, Michelle from the University of Surrey. I'm just wondering from the panel what their thoughts are around the blockchain and the impacts of blockchain, especially in terms of developing countries. Thank you.
Wonderful. Okay. Well, shall we have a go at answering those three, and then we'll take another round? Should we go from far right to? Do you want to start?
Obviously, there's a lot of things that you can do in a very proactive way. So, for example, it's very important to pay people working in the digital parts of government and working in the digital state at a good rate. And that would be a very good way in which aid money and so forth could be, very productively employed. It's creating the capacity for an intelligence center state. And then ensuring that capacity over time. And so really there's no substitute for retaining that capacity in country and then paying people, who've got the skills that you need to stay in the public sector and not migrate. And yet there are some really interesting projects that you could be doing in the public sector. And the real difficulty is how you organize to get that done. In the past, big outsourcing system integrators have taken a lot of staff away from countries and away from government. Now they're in a little bit different thing because there's competition coming in from cloud, and cloud is much easier to organize and do in-house work with than before. So I think there's some very, very positive things. Some of the things that otherwise are unfortunate, like growth of Amazon and Google and cloud-based activities, which makes taxing more difficult, also makes it easier to set up quite good, startup type tax efforts and so forth. So I think there's a lot you can do there. I'll just say one other thing, which is blockchain is an example of a wider type of technological change called distributed ledger technologies. It has some plus points and it has some disadvantages. It's quite intensive in its administrative costings and so forth. One of the things about distributed ledger technologies is they do require virtually free storage that can get bigger and bigger and bigger every year for n number of years to infinity. So you've just got to bear in mind that there are certain difficulties with distributed ledger technologies. But the revolutionary potential of them is that you can move away from a system where there is one central ledger controlled by the state to a system where there are multiple copies of ledgers controlled by actors in civil society as well as in government, and where a high degree of consensus is needed before you change the ledger. So that could be a positive thing in terms of state development in industrializing countries.
Before I allow you to go on, so there was actually the question from the internet was specifically directed towards you, and it was to ask whether you could be a bit more specifically pessimistic. As digital innovation surely works sometimes, like when it allows administrations to automate boring stuff. So what kinds of digital changes are really difficult to do even in the OECD? And that's from Philip Krause.
Well, take, for example, the current real-time information system in which HMRC is rolling out, which gives, for the first time, information on, how much you're being paid during the year. Whereas before, the previous way of collecting information was your employer would pay you during the year. They would say your salary was so-and-so. Actually, the tax authorities didn't know until 18 months after you were paid in some cases, when your employer filled in a special return. And so now all of that's being done as it should have been done basically 18 years ago. But it's taken 18 years to get there, and it's cost a small fortune to do. And wherever you have already developed systems that are operating, paper systems or digital systems, it's costly to move them on.
Great. Claire, could you talk about the arms race? You're involved in one part of that arms race.
So I would comment that the private sector, whilst obviously some players in the private sector are very far ahead in terms of being digital and their whole businesses are totally digital, there are still large swathes of the private sector who are still also on a journey into the digital world, particularly within the finance functions and tax functions specifically, and a lot of the impetus to the tax functions is coming from government, and governments asking for digital submissions of data. So if you think about all the transparency initiatives that we've had via BEPS and some of the FATCA and the Common Reporting Standard type regulatory changes, they're really forcing the private sector to really look at how they deal with the data that they have, how they get it ready to be able to submit to the authorities, and really having to dedicate a lot of time and a lot of resources themselves to being ready and able to submit the information that's required. So definitely they're on a journey as well. Again, different speeds, different focuses, different countries going at different speeds as well. But as big a challenge for the private sector, I think, at the moment.
Sam, could you talk about the concern about people being essentially excluded digitally when it comes to all of this?
Yeah, I will. I mean, one of the things that I've been doing some work in Rwanda. Rwanda's ambition is to have all government online services online by 2024. you can make your own judgment about how realistic you think that may be. But two things just to say. I think one of the things that we could help, or from a donor in terms of, is there is an issue about increasing connectivity and how maybe, I'm thinking more in a developing country context where the donors could support that. Vodafone in Tanzania, when I worked there, had 90% coverage, but for them to move from 90% to 100% probably need to be subsidised. I think that's one way in which the public sector could help. I suppose the other thing I would just, I'll come back to your specific questions to me. The other thing I was going to say was in Martin's point about building trust and trust in government. I think there's a real issue about transparency, which has already been mentioned. I think more needs to be done on that. There's people in the room who are working specifically on transparency. I think that can be done. Just on the will people be excluded? My concern in I suppose in Rwanda is the same as the concern for my father, who's 90. And will he be able to access things if everything becomes online? I think that's a real issue. I don't really have an answer to that, but I do worry about it, both personally and also I worry about the ambition of countries like Rwanda.
Do we have any calls? What's your response to the call for action?
Well, I 100% agree with Ruth that future is it's 100% digital, not analog, and what we need to do is to cultivate the culture of change, the culture of innovation, because there are lots of rapid changes which go on, but you need to recognize that that innovation is quite often there is the failure component present, and I want to say that the public sector is very often very severely punished for failures, and this can bring drawbacks. But if I may also respond to the question on blockchain, the Estonian experience is using the blockchain. We started to use it in 2012, and principally all log files are stored in our case by using this technology, and it's part of transparency, and it's important.
Well, maybe to pick up on the first and last question on the call to action, I think a lot of this has to boil down to politics. It seems to me it has to be politics at various levels. I think. One thing that biometric identifiers should let you do is get rid of inefficient price subsidies. But as Sanjeev says, there is a political constituency behind inefficient price subsidies. So somehow there's a political impediment to be overcome. But I think if you think about, say, what's happened as we heard on the international tax side, both on the sort of exchange of information CRS side and the kind of corporate tax side, that's really showing the power, I think, of people actually perceiving that the system for them isn't working, and that created the political pressure that politicians then go out and say, well, actually, we have to try and make this work, and that's going to involve overcoming some technical obstacles. And I think in some sense the international tax debate may be sort of where we're headed more generally in the sense that these kind of issues are coming up much more rapidly, I think, on that side of things, and the politics is very much to the fore. And I think at some point, and one of our revenue administration colleagues tells us, for example, that as people see benefits in neighbouring countries, as the English see what's going on in Scotland and so on, people do demand better services. So the revenue administration colleague of ours says that, well, people in his country now say, well, why isn't my tax return pre-populated? You have all this information. You're asking me to give it to you again. Can't you just get your act together and save me some trouble? So I think that the politics ultimately has to be the answer to that. Nothing much to add on blockchain, except again, I think the thought of kind of embedding smart contracts that implement tax rules is pretty exciting. I think customs is the obviously initial way to go. But again, these come down to very fundamental things. I mean, if you have blockchain and you have everybody's in the system, it's not clear, for example, that you need a VAT anymore. You just charge final sales. So all this does come down to fairly fundamental issues in how we think about the tax system. But
wonderful. I think that brings us on to our next very, very distinct sections. So we're going to have another round of Q&A, so don't worry, I will come to all questioners. So in this next round, I'm going to ask the panel a few questions, essentially about how the tax system should or will change in response to these things. So clearly, with new technology, you know, the world is our oyster. We can start thinking about things from scratch, or maybe we can't because we have all these legacy systems. But I would invite the panel to think big and to think about what we could do and what we should do. And so first. So Claire, you've spoken about how companies are, you know, essentially catching up, that they're responding to requests from government. If you could characterise how you think the system should change, how would you do that?
So obviously with the onset of all this data and information, from an administration perspective, once administrations have got to grips with how to deal with it, then really the next sort of view is whether there's going to be the need for corporates and individuals to even file the tax return. So we're already thinking about some of the individuals and, you know, some of the countries, Estonia, Sweden, where you get already the pre-populated tax return, and then really thinking about how that applies to the private sector and the corporates. And, you know, so much time at the moment is spent by corporates in complying and getting their global tax returns in on time, whether it's direct tax or indirect tax, sales taxes. And then really the future, we really think, will be that this will not need to be done anymore. If you look forward 5-10 years, so much more technology will be available. Corporates will need to have really understood their own systems. They'll be validating their data as they get it, so real-time transactional data, so that they're then ready to have an exchange with the tax authorities around, you know, the tax authority coming in and making the assessment, and really that's the end of the compliance journey. So really big changes. I don't think they're going to be happening overnight for the reasons we've already talked about, but that's definitely going to be the way of the future, and that will be a fundamental change. So,
I was talking to someone who worked in intellectual property yesterday, in fact, and he said that one of the positive impacts of this tax break for patents is that suddenly every company became aware of the income stream that was related to their patents, right? So sometimes these tax changes can help companies find out more about themselves. Patrick, do you have any hopes for efficiency gains in the UK, maybe putting aside real-time information, universal credit?
Sure. Well, I think the whole way in which tax systems has developed under particularly the tutelage of the OECD for the last 20 years has been very, very destructive. It's been developed towards corporately specified knowledge, so that it's become more and more asymmetrical. And we've had a shift of companies really being able to avoid corporation tax through relatively simple but also relatively obvious kind of gross evasive tactics. And I think that's fueling a lot of current political disaffection in Western liberal countries, that many people feel that life is very unfair if big corporates earn massive incomes and then don't pay tax on it. And what we're seeing now really is a kind of very large-scale movement by ordinary taxpayers, which responds to corporates not paying taxes. And this is, you can see this, for example, in the erosion of the income tax base in the UK. Massive numbers of people are moving their affairs around so that they're not earning income, but they are generating wealth from assets. And this is eroding the income tax base at a pretty remarkable rate, and has completely transformed the housing market and put an end to the Thatcherite the dream of a property-owning democracy. So what we really need is a kind of a rethinking of tax systems that re-specifies, robustness, simplicity, physical clarification. And actually, I thought the suggestions in the speech of a lifetime income tax and individualized VAT, that just makes me want to pull my hair out, because that would just be, lunacy. It would be madness, really. You could do some smart type things, So, for example, if you had traffic fines that were related to people's income or wealth, which I think is true in Norway or Finland, sorry, that would be an interesting thing, because then people see that this is, you know, a millionaire gets fined £200. They can see that that's no disincentive. The millionaire fined, you know, £15,000. They can see people are being treated equally. And the fundamental thing you've got to remember about tax, especially in Western industrialized countries now, it's a quasi-voluntary thing. People pay tax so long as they think everybody else is paying tax. As soon as that confidence or trust is destroyed or queried or undermined, the adverse consequences for revenue collection are just terrible. Now, you can compensate by, you know, doing real-time tax information. That speeds up the proportion of tax that you can collect. But if the confidence and trust goes, the system will spiral quickly into a very fragile condition. That's my gloomy view.
More optimism. Thank you. So next, I actually want to ask Martin a question from Anonymous from the internet. No, not from Anonymous, from Abigail Hunt of the ODI. How did you secure the participation of Uber in fiscal revenue collection, and is this something you think can be rolled out to all gig economy platforms operating in Estonia?
Cooperation with Uber, I think it goes back a few years time, and I have been told that when Uber came to Estonia, then we had already our own similar company, but then we warmly welcomed. We warmly welcomed, because Estonia we are promoting us as a test bed for new technologies, and what happened? Our tax office sat together with them behind the same table, and they were to work out some solution for the taxation. Principally, what is the important here is dialogue with industry, because you want to have in the end a solution which does not put very high administrative burden, and for that purpose you need to work together. Engagement is by engaging them, you principally bring people, or you will improve their tax obedience. That's one message. But on the other hand, government must also be innovative, and the way how we have responded to new digital business models is first we have a new form of entrepreneurship, because there are quite often there are services which one person is providing to the other. So there is one new form of entrepreneurship where you don't have any sort of reporting duty to the government. You don't need to do any tax accounting, and you will have from these revenues a flat rate, so of 20%. And there is a limit, upper limit on your annual income. It's 25,000. So this was our response, just to develop new form of entrepreneurship. And let me a little bit broaden the issue. I think the innovation is important on the public sector side. We always need to pay attention on the cost side of collecting taxes, for that purpose, we have been working on making our services as seamless as possible, and in this regard, we are launching next year a new new service for the corporations, which is called Reporting 3.0. So somewhere in the middle, and after that, principally for all small and medium-sized corporations, the tax collection becomes fully automatic. No touch is needed. But it means that the tax office has been given access to all the data that the corporation has. And I believe that this is one way to go. So you need to make the process of paying taxes very convenient and easy for corporations, and this is my answer. Thank you.
Great, wonderful. Michael, what does this all mean for the IMF policy towards developing countries?
Okay. Well, actually, I have to begin first by throwing the lunacy charge back, I'm afraid, at Patrick. I think if you think about yes, you can. I think you're right. It's Finland. I think has the kind of penalties related to the income of the person who causes the damage, because the rationale for these kind of penalties is a Pigovian rationale. It's the damage they cause that you correct for. So the the efficient charge. Let me be an economist for him. The efficient charge is independent of the wealth of the person who causes the damage. It might, if you want to make it depend on the wealth of the person who's harmed. Yes, and if you want to tax high wealth people properly, don't do it when they happen to cause accidents. Just have a proper way of taxing them, which is what a lifetime tax. I'm not saying that's all you'd do. You'd have proper inheritance, estate tax, and so on. That's what that would do. So, I think I have to send the lunacy back. I mean, is it particularly sane to tax people on the income they happen to earn or manage to squeeze into the period that it takes the Earth to go around the sun? That doesn't seem a particularly rational way of thinking about things. But and maybe things appeal to people in ways we find hard to understand. But I think it's our responsibility to actually explain that there are some basic economic forces at work that we shouldn't completely ignore. But what was the question?
What does it mean for the IMF?
Yeah, actually I did know really. Well, I mean, I think the book is largely about, I think, trying to inform our work with countries, and Sanjeev mentioned the work in Senegal and Uganda, where we are proactively engaging with support of the Gates Foundation. I think one thing that's quite interesting is I suspect that it's going to be quite different from some of the technical assistance we give traditionally. There's a kind of tradition of technical assistance, someone has the answers and they kind of fly in, deposit the answers and fly out again. I think just by the nature of the topic and the fact that it's changing so quickly, it's going to be a much more collaborative exercise as we learn, and that's, I think, actually a much more productive form of engagement. I'm sure terrible things will happen, but nonetheless, I think that's a good way to go. I think for us, it means we have to think about the skills we have within the fund. So, for example, in the Fiscal Affairs Department, where we are, we now have a little unit of 4 people to kind of who are not economists, they're not really research assistants, but they're the sort of people who can help us with knowledge management and dissemination. And they actually understand what blockchain is. So unlike me, they don't BS about it. They actually can do it and understand it. And I think that's kind of important for the work we do. It makes the mark already for some of the analytical work that we do, and I'm sure others do. For example, many countries want to know, well, what is the compliance gap? What is the gap between the VAT I collect and what, legally I should collect? And we used to do that by kind of looking at national accounts and, some survey data 5 years ago. But now you say, okay, well, give us your universe of VAT returns, and we'll do it on that basis. So it's moving along. And I think it's important, to mention, particularly for this audience, that there's a lot of very good academic work going on now on these issues. I mean, not necessarily teaching lots of lessons that we didn't already know, to be honest, but nonetheless, I think there's a lot to be learned there. But I think probably our most fundamental point for our work, I think, and for others, is that really technology never solved any problem in itself. This is all to do with making sure that within a wider reform process, the processes and systems are in place that are aligned with the technology. So I think we're a little bit cautious about the idea of leapfrogging for that kind of reason. We know there are lots of countries that have great websites and stuff, but actually behind it there's kind of nothing there. So I think, and that fits in with something Sanjeev also mentioned, that we, and I think our other partners in something called the Platform for Collaboration on Tax, and moving much more towards medium-term engagements with countries over 4 or 6 years. And I think this fits very nicely. But could I actually go back very quickly to one of Patrick's points? Because I did agree with one. There was one I agreed with somewhere. No, but it was no. I think I think it's really to amplify your remarks. I think about the international tax system basically being broken. I mean, I think that's true. But I think actually the problem is deeper than that. I think it's deeper than fixing avoidance by companies. I think it goes beyond really the topic of today. The deeper problem is competition between governments. In some sense, even if you fix avoidance, even if you make avoidance harder, that just gives governments more of an incentive to compete by cutting tax rates and offering perfectly good legal deals. So I agree with the notion that this is a kind of sharp end of the spear in terms of things in the current system that aren't working well. But I do think that actually that's a problem that even digitalization is not going to solve, is the way that governments interact with one another. Sorry, I sort of moved around.
That's fine. That's fine. Anything that promotes panel harmony is good. And finally, Simon, what do you think donors should be doing differently?
Okay, I've got 3 challenges for donors. I know there are donors in the audience. I think there's been a long-standing debate about use of country systems and making data available in the form that is suitable. I think that far more could be done by donors than that. I know Rupert's in the audience from Publish What You Fund, but on the whole, donors just churn out information which countries find it difficult to use to make allocation of resources. They don't understand the data's in the wrong formats. I think it's one challenge in terms of using country systems and making data available. I think promoting accessibility is really important. I think more could be done on that. And I think I would really like to see, I think the book's actually interesting, particularly the latter chapters on practical examples. I would really like to see donors tackling or helping governments tackle real challenges. One of the problems, for example, in education delivery is teacher absenteeism. It's not necessarily money not getting there, it's teacher absenteeism. Is there a role of technology in doing that? And can donors pick on some of these more difficult problems and really help? Maybe not quite the digitalisation point, but I think that's important.
Wonderful. And now for questions from the audience. And again, I have my super questioner hopefully lined up. No, who's looking very surprised. So maybe I'll return to him after asking a question from this gentleman over here.
Thanks. My name is Paolo Gaurizio from the International Budget Partnership. I've got actually 2 quick questions. The first one is about the fact that much of what has been talked about is about efficiency and effectiveness in many ways, sort of how things can function better, more smoothly and faster. And in our work, we worry about the impact on actual citizens. And if information is power, and if we're likely to sort of see increasing amounts of information being analyzed and then being shared and possibly being made publicly available, what, in the view of the panel, is the possible impact of digital revolutions in public finance in empowering ordinary citizens? That's question number 1. Question number 2 is a crystal ball question. Many of us grew up in a world where basically there was no internet, no cell phones, nothing like all of this stuff that we're talking about. And we know that not only change is happening fast, but it's happening faster every time. So if we accept Moore's law, the kind of conversation that we're having today in 10 years' time would be a hugely different kind of conversation. And a 10-year delay today would be like a 100 years delay 10 years down the line. So the question is, can you look into the crystal ball and tell us what kind of a conversation we might be having in 10 years' time around these same issues? Thanks.
I think this will have to be our final question. We don't have a question from the super questioner or a comment. Yep. Mm-hmm.
Okay, thank you. My comment is essentially on drawing from the Ugandan experience in terms of the opportunity which digitalization presents. We have definitely seen, seen benefits of, for example, linking the IFMS system and our payroll management system, both in terms of using the system to eliminate, ghost workers, but also in terms of improving the efficiency with which people are actually paid. And you can actually, go down and monitor that and actually see the benefit, which are accruing, directly from, implementing that linkage. Now, the second opportunity we've seen is something which we are trying to pilot and actually learning from the Kenyan example in terms of using technology to expedite the payment system as part of the payment system. And this is specifically using the mobile M-Pesa, for paying for traffic fines. Of course, a different issue from what has been discussed by the panelists. But in terms of it actually represents a very big opportunity because in terms of the speed with which the payments are made, but also in terms of eliminating the leakage of resources because and saving even the time of the drivers themselves, the people who actually who are fined. Now, in the case of Uganda, what we actually found is that over 70% of the fines actually are not paid because essentially how the system works is by issuing a paper, a document which you are expected to go first of all to either the police station and then of course eventually to go to the bank. Now the difference in Kenya is that it is actually an instant mechanism. So when you are caught after committing a traffic offense, you are fined there and then, and you are actually given an opportunity to use M-Pesa and effectively make the payment. And in terms of revenue to the state, it has definitely, contributed, improved the system a lot. Now, of course, I also like the question of Simon actually hinted on this issue because I think we need to explore the opportunity of digitalization in terms of using it to, for example, monitor, teacher attendance or the attendance of health workers in the health delivery system, in the health facilities. To what extent can we actually use these systems, especially in countries like ours, where most of the traditional monitoring systems have actually broken down? So how can we use digital systems or computerized systems, to ensure that services are being delivered, to the population? Now, one more point on the challenges. I think one of the challenges which we are seeing is, I think also it has been hinted on actually. One challenge, of course, is the extent of connectivity of these countries. Many of the countries, of course, if you are talking of services reaching at the far end of, a particular rural or local government or whatever, of course, the extent of connectivity is limited. And then, of course, there's also the challenge of cost. Many of these systems are extremely expensive. We have seen it from the IFMSCs and, all these, computerized systems. They are quite expensive. So there's a question of, the cost of the systems. But I think overall, there are definitely a lot of benefits, accruing from these systems in terms of, the issues of efficiency and helping to improve the effectiveness of the delivery of the services. But at the end of the day, I think what matters is ensuring that the country context is put into account, in implementing these systems. Thank you.
Sorry, I should have introduced, that was Kenneth Mugambe, who is the Director of Budget in the Ugandan Ministry of Finance. Wonderful. Do we have any more questions from the audience? I think this will be the final question. If so, yes, gentleman here.
Jan Petke, Ernst & Young, Germany. Digital revolution is a quite big word, in particular for public financial management. Is quite difficult to achieve. And for me, one precondition for proper public finance management is education. So I assume that education or proper education or computer literacy is a huge obstacle to achieve digital revolutions in a lot of countries. So how would you assess the costs or the possibilities of proper education for the society in general? It's not about only the public service system. It's also about civil society and the economy to deal with the digital revolutions or modern technologies.
Thank you. Wonderful. Okay, so I'm going to go around the panel one final time, and then at the end, I'm just going to warn them of this now. I'm going to ask you to give your summary, your one-sentence summary of what your main takeaway from this has been. So prepare for that, to deliver that kind of punchy summary. But first, shall we answer the questions? Patrick, we had questions, a crystal ball question. We had a question about empowering citizens and the importance of education. Answer what you would like.
Well, I think, probably we'll be here in 10 years' time having pretty much the same, well, you'll be here, but I probably won't, having pretty much the same discussion and lamenting the fact that actually change takes a lot longer to happen than we thought it would. But, you know, I can't remember who it was, maybe it was, I can't remember who it was who said change takes longer to happen than you think it was possible, and then it happens faster than you ever thought it could. So we've got to hope for that. But I think it's vital to be pretty realistic to think that technical change, digital, requires institutional change. It has to fit with cultural context, as Kenneth was saying. And those sorts of things take a little bit more time to meld in than you might think. So that would be my 10 years prediction. Sorry.
Claire?
I'm not going to answer the 10-year prediction one. I don't know yet. I'll think about that one. But in terms of the point about will all information be made available to everybody? Will everything be open and transparent? I think that's very difficult. I don't think anytime soon we'll be seeing that from a sort of an agreement or a policy perspective. The risks and challenges around everything being available are obviously, and this comes then to the education point as well. What do you do with that information? How do you interpret it? What does it mean? And so, you know, for these reasons, I think things will still be governed by, you know, a degree of confidentiality, and, you know, the way that this would change probably isn't in the 10-year horizon either, I would suggest. But education around interpreting the information which does become available, again, thinking back to transparency and other information exchanges is critical in how we sort of understand the information which we are allowed to see.
Simon?
Just two quick things. I mean, I asked myself the question, you know, would I be comfortable for the state to know everything about me? And I think the point that was made earlier about trust and a whole raft of other things in terms of confidence in the state is really important. On the education one, I'm less worried about that. Two things I would say is children can operate smartphones and do lots of things, and their education is variable. But I think what is incumbent on governments and others is to work harder to make the information as accessible and usable as possible. And I think that is a responsibility for governments, that therefore the education gap is smaller, effectively.
Mm-hmm. Martin?
On the question, impact on citizens, I think there is one area, it's cybersecurity and privacy, because people must feel themselves in the same way secure, whether they are offline or online. So it's the duty of the government that the people feel themselves safe in the cyber domain, and that the information that you have digitalized, that it's accurate. So it's important to work on this. Then on the question, what will be in a 10 years time, I believe that there is much more artificial intelligence. We see it's spreading, and it helps increasingly people to make their decisions. So this is what I believe in. And when it comes to education, then absolutely, digital literacy is important. The education is important, determinant how people will go along with digitalization, and how much attention do they pay on cyber hygiene. So it's a must. So.
And Michael?
I think not much to add to those comments. I think on what we'll be saying in 10 years' time, I'm just sure we'll be embarrassed to look back at what we've said today, how much was naive and how we missed some completely obvious big trend. You know, I think 10 years ago, as I was saying, we would have said automatic. I would have said automatic exchange of information. Okay, could we dream on? But I'm sure we've missed something. I'm sure we've missed something big. I think on not much to add on, but I think one thing, I agree with Martin, one thing we haven't actually talked much about is sort of artificial intelligence and cognitive computing, and I think that is something that we're only really even beginning to sense what that might mean. Education, again, I think is key. I think on education, there's a bit of a circle here, I think, with the link with digitalization. And I would maybe just refer you to the chapter in the book that looks at actually the impact on digital methods on kind of delivery of education services and effectiveness of education services, which is sort of the other half of the circle in a way, perhaps. But yeah.
Wonderful. And now, as I warned the panelists, I would love a one-sentence summary of your main theme. Patrick, optimism.
Well, go forward, hopefully, but recognise that you're in an arms race, and don't expect that you'll ever get to kind of a digital panacea. If you see.
Okay, I'll go next. I would say that the change is definitely coming. It's coming quite quickly, so embrace it. Be keen to learn about what is changing, and be quite agile in the thinking around how quickly things change and what you do about it.
Institutions and politics matter, and building trust is very important.
My last sentence would be pretty much is the same message that the world is going to be 100% digital. So whether we want or not, we need to ensure that this transition is going to be as smooth as possible, and build trust, and don't be afraid of failures.
I have a few commas, possibly even a semicolon or two, maybe. No, I think just distrust hype. Remember that getting the boring stuff right is still important, but think big. Maybe.
Not too many commas.
Well, I'll throw a few more in if you like. There's a dash at the end.
That's fine. Wonderful. So thank you. I think my main takeaway is that this is hugely exciting. We don't know what we don't know, and lots will change. And I will end on an anecdote, which is my very first job was actually cleaning data provided. It was national insurance records, and there was a very alarming moment in my research where I discovered that half of the people in my data set, the national insurance system started in after the Second World War, half of my data set seemed to be born in 1753, which was problematic and alarming. And so, my call to action would be, when you collect this data, think about what it might be used for. Make sure you don't make everyone born in 1753 by accident. Thank you.